On the 28th of April 1996, Martin John Bryant would commit an atrocity so horrifying it would change the lives of many families, shock the nation of Australia, and tighten gun laws forever. Our episodes deal with serious and often distressing incidents. If at any time you feel like you need support, please contact your local crisis centre. This episode involves mass murder, which resulted in the deaths of 35 people. Some victims included children. Some of the details that we explore are graphic in nature and describe in great detail the accounts of what occurred that day. This episode also discusses the injuries sustained to the victims. It may not be suitable for all listeners. Listener discretion is advised. Martin Bryant was born on the 7th of May 1967 at the Queen Alexandra Hospital in Hobart, Tasmania. He was the first child of Maurice and Carleen Bryant. As a child, Bryant was described as different. Those that knew Bryant would recall his abnormal behaviour as a child, such as pulling a snorkel from another boy while diving and cutting down trees on neighbours' properties. He was described by some teachers as being distant from reality and unemotional. At school, Bryant was a disruptive and sometimes violent child who suffered severe bullying by other children. After he was suspended from Newtown Primary School in 1977, psychological assessments noted that he tortured animals. Bryant returned to school the following year with improved behaviour. However, he persisted in teasing younger children. He was transferred to a special education unit at Newtown High School in 1980, where he deteriorated both academically and behaviourally throughout his remaining school years. Descriptions of Bryant's behaviour as an adolescent show that he continued to be disturbed and outlined the possibility of an intellectual disability. When leaving school in 1983, he was assessed for a disability pension by a psychiatrist who wrote, quote, "Cannot read or write, does a bit of gardening and watches TV. Only his parents' efforts prevent further deterioration. Could be schizophrenic, and parents face a bleak future with him." Bryant received a disability pension, though he also worked as a handyman and gardener. In an examination after the massacre, forensic psychiatrist Ian Joblin found Bryant to be borderline mentally disabled with an IQ of 66. Equivalent to an 11-year-old. In early 1987, when Bryant was 19, and while looking for new customers for his lawn mowing service, he met 54-year-old Helen Mary Elizabeth Harvey, heiress to a share in the Tattersall lottery fortune. Helen, who lived with her mother Hilza, befriended Bryant, who became a regular visitor to her neglected mansion in Newtown, and assisted with tasks such as feeding the 14 dogs living inside the house and the 40 cats living inside her garage. In June 1990, an unidentified person reported Helen to the health authorities, and medics found both Helen and her mother in need of urgent hospital treatment, with Helen suffering from infected ulcers and Hilza with a hip fracture. Hilza Harvey was moved into a nursing home and died several weeks later at the age of 79. A mandatory clean-up order was placed on the decaying mansion, and Bryant's father took long service leave to assist in cleaning the interior. The local RSPCA unit had to confiscate many animals living in the house. Following the mandatory clean-up, Helen invited Bryant to live with her in the mansion, and they began spending extravagant amounts of money, which included the purchase of more than 30 new cars in less than 3 years. The odd pair of friends began to spend most of their days together, extensively shopping, usually after having lunch in a local restaurant. Around this time, Bryant was reassessed for his pension, and a note was attached to the paperwork with, quote, "Father protects him from any occasion which might upset him, as he continually threatens violence. Martin tells me he would like to go around shooting people. It would be unsafe to allow Martin out of his parents' control." In 1991, as a result of no longer being allowed to have animals at the house, Harvey and Bryant moved together onto a 29-hectare or 72-acre farm called Taurusville that she had purchased in Copping, a small township. Neighbours recalled that Bryant always carried an air gun and often fired it at tourists as they stopped by to buy apples at a stall on the highway, and that late at night he would roam through the surrounding properties, firing the gun at dogs when they barked at him. They avoided him at all costs, despite his attempts to befriend them. On the 20th of October 1992, Harvey was killed at the age of 59 along with two of her dogs when her car veered onto the wrong side of the road and hit an oncoming car directly. Bryant was inside the vehicle at the time of the accident and was hospitalised for 7 months with severe neck and back injuries. He was briefly investigated by police for the role he played in the accident. Bryant had a known habit of lunging for the steering wheel, and Harvey had already had 3 accidents as a result. She often told people that this was the reason she never drove faster than 60 kilometers an hour. Harvey even allegedly said to a neighbour that, quote, "One of these days, the little bastard is going to kill me." Bryant was named the sole beneficiary of Harvey's will and came into possession of assets totalling more than 550,000 Australian dollars. As Bryant had only the vaguest notions of financial matters, his mother subsequently applied for and was granted a guardianship order, placing Bryant's assets under the management of public trustees. The order was placed on evidence of Bryant's diminished intellectual capacity. Bryant returned to the family home to rest after leaving hospital. After Harvey's death, Bryant's 60-year-old father, Maurice Bryant, looked after the Copping farm. Shortly after this, Maurice had been prescribed antidepressants and had discreetly transferred his joint bank account and utilities into his wife's name. 2 months later, on the 14th of August 1993, a visitor looking for Maurice at the Copping property found a note saying, "Call the police," pinned to the door, and found several $1,000s in his car. The rates officer at the time found no reason to suspect criminal intent and sent council members and police to quell the stresses put forward by the letters sent to the local council chambers. Police searched the property for Maurice, without success. Divers were called in to search the 4 dams on the property, and on the 16th of August, his body was found in the dam closest to the farmhouse, with a diving weight belt around his neck. Police described the death as unnatural, and it was ruled a suicide. Bryant then inherited the proceeds of his father's superannuation fund, valued at 250,000 Australian dollars. Bryant's father had tried to purchase a bed and breakfast property called Seascape, but Nolene, also known as Sally, and David Martin bought this property before his father could ready his finances, much to the disappointment of Bryant's father, who often complained to his son of the double dealing the Martins had done to secure the property. Bryant's father offered to buy another property from the Martins at Palmer's Lookout Road, but they declined the offer. Bryant apparently believed that the Martins had deliberately bought the property to hurt his family and believed this event to be responsible for the depression that led to his father's 1993 suicide. Bryant later described the Martins as very mean people and as the worst people in my life. Investigators believe that this may have been the main motivation for the massacre and to inflict revenge on the Martins. Bryant later sold the Copping farm for 143,000 Australian dollars, but kept the Newtown mansion. While living at Copping, the white overalls he habitually wore were replaced with clothing more in line with Harvey's financial status. Now that he was alone, Bryant's dress became more bizarre. He often wore a grey linen suit, cravat, lizard skin shoes, and a Panama hat while carrying a briefcase during the day, telling anyone who would listen that he had a well-paying career as a businessman. He often wore an electric blue suit with flared trousers and a ruffled shirt to the restaurant he frequented. With both his father and Harvey dead, Bryant became increasingly lonely. From 1993 to late 1995, He visited various overseas countries 14 times, and a summary of his domestic airline travel filled 3 pages. Bryant had felt as lonely travelling as he did back home in Tasmania. He enjoyed the flights as he could speak to the people sitting adjacent to him who had no choice but to be polite. He later took great joy in describing some of the conversations he had with fellow passengers. Bryant ultimately became suicidal after deciding he had had enough. He stated, quote, "I just felt more people were against me. When I tried to be friendly towards them, they just walked away." Although he had previously been little more than a social drinker, Bryant's alcohol consumption increased, and although he had not consumed any alcohol on the day of the Port Arthur massacre, had especially escalated in the 6 months prior to that day. His average daily consumption was estimated at half a bottle of Sambuca and a bottle of Bailey's Irish Cream, supplemented with port wine and other sweet alcoholic drinks. According to Bryant, the plan for Port Arthur first occurred to him 4 to 12 weeks before the event. In early 1996, Bryant advertised in the Mercury newspaper for a gardener's position at his home in Clare Street. That advertisement was answered by, amongst others, Miss Petra Wilmot. She was subsequently employed. After a short time of being employed by Bryant, Miss Wilmot became friendly with him, ceased working for him, and then started to go out with him on a regular basis, often staying overnight at his house. She stayed at his house for 4 successive nights up to and including the 27th of April 1996, the night before Bryant committed the massacre. On the 15th of April 1996, Wilmot accompanied Bryant into Hobart to go shopping, less than 2 weeks before the incident. She was in the Myer store in Hobart with Bryant when he purchased a Prince sports bag. Having first measured that bag with a tape measure he had taken with him. Prosecutors believed that he was measuring the bag to determine whether or not it had the capacity to carry the semi-automatic weapons he would take with him during the massacre. He turned to Miss Wilmot and asked her if the bag would be big enough. When Wilmot asked what for, he told her that he was going to use it for Tai Chi. However, in an aside conversation with the shop assistant, he told the assistant that the bag had to be strong enough as it would need to carry ammunition, which would be heavy. This bag would allow Bryant an element of surprise and as an illustration of his pre-planning for what he did on the 28th of April. Wilmot stated that after seeing that bag at the time of purchase, she did not, on any other occasion, see it either at Bryant's home or in his possession. It's believed that it was most likely hidden with his firearms and ammunition. On the 25th of April, Anzac Day, Bryant travelled to Richmond with Wilmot, ostensibly to test out his camera for which he had purchased new batteries. At Richmond, Bryant spoke to one shopkeeper and asked her how busy it was in Richmond on Sundays. On Saturday the 27th of April, Bryant spent the day in the company of Wilmot and in the evening had dinner at his mother's house. On this occasion, Wilmot said that Bryant appeared to consume more alcohol than his usual practice. He became talkative and aggressive in a make-believe way towards his mother. After leaving his mother's home, they travelled to a local nightclub and then returned to the Clare Street property, where Bryant set his alarm clock for 6 a.m. the following day. Wilmot said to police in later interviews that this was out of character for Bryant, as he had never used an alarm clock, nor had he risen that early before. Bryant's home in Clare Street is fitted with an electronic alarm system. The police later discovered that the alarm had been set at 9:47 a.m. on Sunday the 28th of April, believed to be the time Bryant left the house. He left driving his yellow Volvo sedan with his surfboard on the roof, carrying with him at that time the .223 caliber AR-15 semi-automatic rifle, a 3.8 caliber L1A1 self-loading rifle, a semi-automatic Daewoo 12-gauge shotgun. He also had with him 2 sets of handcuffs, sash cord rope, and a hunting knife, as well as a number of containers of petrol. We will now move on to the detailed events of the day. A reminder that some of the details that we explore are graphic in nature and describe in great detail the accounts of what occurred that day. This segment also discusses the injuries sustained to the victims. It may not be suitable for all listeners. Listener discretion is advised. The events of the day have been taken from official police and court reports and transcripts, and list detailed accounts from several people of what occurred on that day. On the 28th of April 1996, at approximately 10:30 am, Bryant arrived at the Midway Point news agency and purchased a cigarette lighter from the proprietor, Mr. Angelo Kesarius. The owner recognised Bryant because he used to call in at the news agency on a regular basis approximately 18 months previously. The usual time of his arrival was 6 am. Kesarius said that he had the assumption at the time that Bryant had an early work commitment to be arriving at his shop at such an early hour of the day. But in fact, Bryant's real reason for doing so was that he was living in the Copping district, which was too far to walk anywhere. He did not have a driver's license, and he therefore drove at a time in an attempt to avoid police detection. When he had been in the shop on previous occasions, he would giggle inappropriately, but was always outgoing in his manner. But on this occasion, Kesarius noticed that his demeanour was quite different. He didn't pass any pleasantries. He didn't show any recognition of the proprietor, although they had obviously exchanged conversation on a number of occasions before. He purchased a cigarette lighter, leaving more money than was necessary to pay for it, before departing abruptly. Bryant then travelled to the township of Sorrel, where he stopped at the local supermarket and purchased a bottle of tomato sauce. The proprietor of the supermarket, Mr. Diamantis, noticed that he was carrying a large sports-type bag. He therefore watched his movements in the supermarket closely. When he left, he paid for his purchase with a large quantity of small denomination coins. Bryant then travelled further south to the village of Fawcett, arriving there between 11 am and 12 midday. He stopped at the Shell service station and spoke to the proprietor, Mr. Gary King, and requested a cup of coffee. He told Mr. King that he had been there earlier in the week and had enjoyed the cup of coffee he had on that occasion. But he said, on this occasion, would you boil the kettle for less time? He paid for the coffee in 5 and 10 cent coins and told Mr. King that he was going to Roaring Beach to surf. Mr. King thought that was strange because it was a very calm day and he certainly didn't expect that the sea conditions would be conducive to surfing. There were a number of other sightings of Bryant during his trip to Port Arthur. Those sightings occurred in the Eagle Hawk Neck area and at some of the tourist attractions near Eagle Hawk Neck. He moved on from Fawcett through Eagle Hawk Neck and then down to the peninsula at Tirana, where he stopped at the service station and purchased $15 worth of petrol. From there, he drove on to Port Arthur. Mr. Christopher Hammond, a long-time resident of the peninsula and proprietor of the service station, said that when he served Bryant the petrol, he stood looking out across Norfolk Bay with Bryant and said the water looked mirror calm, and he was rather surprised to see someone with a surfboard travelling down there in those calm weather conditions. Bryant then travelled on from there towards Port Arthur. On his way, Bryant stopped at the Seascape guest accommodation where he would enter the property and kill his first victims, Nolene and David Martin. Several witnesses heard what they described as gunshots. One witness heard 2 shots at around 11 am. He knew the Martins well and knew on that day that it was David's birthday. Further down towards Port Arthur, near the boat ramp, another witness heard a series of rapidly fired shots, and his best estimate put the time of this between 12 p.m. and 12:30 p.m. With some experience with firearms, he estimated that the caliber of the rifle used was larger than a .22. The witness believed that he heard between 6 and 12 shots. This same witness would later hear further shooting when Bryant was in Port Arthur. Tourists to Tasmania at the time, Donald and Stephanie Gunn, had spent the night at the seascape. They departed at about 11:15 to 11:20 a.m, and at that time, David and Nolene Martin were in residence. All the other guests had departed. The Gunns stayed chatting to Mr. and Mrs. Martin, and then later, when they departed, they noted that both of the Martins were engaged in chores about the seascape. At about 11:45 a.m, a Peninsula resident, Mr. Copping, drove past Seascape on the Arthur Highway. He had known the Martins for a number of years, and when he looked towards the Seascape building, he observed a yellow Volvo sedan backed up into the front door of the main home with the driver's door open. There was a surfboard on the rack, and he took particular notice of this because, being a person who had surfed in the area many years before, he knew that the weather was not good for surfing. He drove through past Port Arthur Township and then returned at about 12:40 p.m. back towards the seascape. And as he did so, he noticed the yellow Volvo being driven towards Port Arthur, about 200 metres south of the general store at Port Arthur itself. Two other tourists, Maureen and John Mason, who had visited Port Arthur and were returning to catch a flight from Hobart, called in to look at the seascape premises on their way out of the peninsula at about 12:30 p.m. They had noticed the property on the way into Port Arthur, and they were attracted by it and thought that they might come back and visit the premises on a future holiday. Maureen said that her husband stopped the car. They both alighted from the vehicle and started to walk towards the house. She saw a squarish shaped vehicle near the house, but didn't take any particular note of it. Suddenly, a young man appeared in front of her out of nowhere. He appeared agitated. He was making jerking movements with his hands and wasn't still, moving about nervously. That man was Martin Bryant. The couple asked him if they could look at some of the apartments on the property. Bryant replied, "No, my mother and father are out for 10 minutes. He said, "I can't show you around because I've got my girlfriend inside." Mrs. Mason described his manner of speech as strange and believed that his manner of speaking was like something was wrong. His manner of speech was not natural, and she said that he appeared quite rude and she became uneasy about him. Feeling uneasy, they then left the property. Both Mr. and Mrs. Mason then re-entered the car, drove away from the property, back along the highway. Mrs. Mason looked back over her shoulder as the car travelled onto the highway, and she said that the person she had spoken to was standing in front of the house looking in their direction. Their time of departure was about 12:35 p.m. Police therefore believe that between 11:45 and 12:40 p.m, Martin Bryant shot and killed Mr. and Mrs. Martin. Shortly after this, Bryant left the seascape and drove towards Port Arthur in his Volvo. He had with him at the time the keys to the seascape properties, which had been locked following his killing of Mr. and Mrs. Martin. These keys were later recovered from the Volvo sedan when he abandoned it near the toll booth. On his way to Port Arthur, he stopped to speak with two persons whose motor vehicle had overheated and was stationary on the roadside. This was just past the seascape property. Bryant chatted to them briefly and was asked if he was going surfing because of the surfboard on the roof racks. He replied, "No, I'm going to the Isle of the Dead to get rid of some wasps." He then suggested that they meet later at the cafe at Port Arthur when he said, "You can shout me a cup of coffee." From there, Bryant travelled past the historic site to Palmer's Lookout Road. There he stopped his car and spoke with a long-term resident, Mr. Roger Lana, whom he had known for a number of years. Bryant's parents had owned a seaside holiday property, and approximately 15 years previously, Mr. Lana had met Mr. and Mrs. Bryant and their son Martin. Bryant would speak with Lana for several minutes, during which he stated that he was interested in purchasing property in the area, possibly the seascape from the Martins. He then asked Mr. Lana if his wife was at home, and Mr. Lana said, yes, she's up at the house. Bryant asked if it was alright if he could go up to the house to see her, and Mr. Lana responded, yes, that would be alright, and I will come up with you. Bryant then quickly changed his mind and responded that he might go to Nabina first and then come back later in the afternoon. Sometime previously, and after the death of Martin Bryant's father, Bryant had met Mrs. Lana accidentally at Newtown, and after that meeting, he had made a nuisance of himself and rung Mrs. Lana on a number of occasions, which she considered a nuisance. As a consequence, she reported the calls to the police. As retribution for this, police believed this was another indication that Bryant intended to murder Mrs. Lana, but changed his mind when Mr. Lana also wanted to come up with him. Bryant then travelled back from Palmer's Lookout Road to the entrance to the historic site. His vehicle was observed entering the site by tourists following him, and he was also seen by a member of the historic site staff operating the toll booth on that day. That person estimates that at approximately 1:10 to 1:15 p.m, she observed a yellow Volvo sedan in a line of vehicles waiting to enter the site. She noticed the surfboard on the roof racks, and she noticed the sudden backwards movement in the vehicle whilst it was in the queue. When the vehicle arrived at the toll booth window, Bryant complained that the driver in front of him had reversed without warning towards him. Bryant then drove down Jetty Road towards the car park near the Broad Arrow Cafe. At about 1:25 p.m, the security manager at the site, Mr. Ian Kingston, was directing people in the car park when he saw Bryant, who indicated that he wanted to park his vehicle near the water's edge. Mr. Kingston directed him away from that area because it is normally reserved for camper vans, and the car park area was quite busy on that day. Bryant became argumentative, but drove off in his car and parked it near the information centre. Mr. Kingston attended other matters, but then later noticed that Bryant had moved his car back to the water's edge. He saw Bryant alight from the car carrying a sports-type bag and a video camera. He then walked towards the Broad Arrow Cafe. At this stage, Mr. Kingston didn't take any further notice of Bryant. During the mid-lunch busy period at the Broad Arrow Cafe on the 28th of April, there were at least 60 customers either seated within the Broad Arrow Cafe or waiting to be served for takeaway meals. Some others were browsing in the souvenir and gift shop area. Bryant entered the Broad Arrow Cafe at about 1:30 p.m. He stood at the servery and obtained a cup of fruit juice and a can of fruit. He left the cafe to take a seat outside, and as he left, the door was held open for him at his request by Mrs. Carol Pierce and Mrs. Carmel Edwards, members of a party of 10 who were just entering the cafe. Comments were made to Bryant about the size of his meal which he was taking out with him, and he responded saying that he had been surfing all day. He walked onto the balcony and seated himself at one of the tables on the edge of the second last table before the gap on the balcony. When he sat down at that table, he commented in a loud voice that there were a lot of wasps about. One person who was dining on the balcony at that time, Mrs. Sullivan, said that she hadn't seen any and made a comment to that effect to Bryant. Bryant then spoke to people at or near the table he had seated himself at, and he questioned them about parking problems and whether they had had any difficulties. Bryant stated that he had had problems, but that he had parked where he wanted to anyway. Seated at the table next to him was a Melbourne couple, Michael Beekman and Rebecca McKenna. Beekman and McKenna said that Bryant appeared to be talking to himself. He mentioned wasps and spoke to McKenna. He also said that there were not many Japanese tourists at the site that day. The couple tried to ignore him. Mr. Beekman noted that he was eating his food quickly. They observed him gather up his bag, tray and other possessions and go back into the cafe. Beekman said that someone opened the door for him again. Another couple, Mr. and Mrs. Williams, on a coach tour, also sat outside. He spoke to them in similar terms. They later went on to their coach, a coach which Bryant would later shoot at. Another couple, Mr. and Mrs. Kelly, entered the cafe shortly after Bryant. They had been at the outdoor tables and had entered to leave their cups and look for souvenirs. Bryant then walked into the dining area of the cafe and placed his bag on a table in the northwestern corner of the cafe. The table that he placed the sports bag on was not occupied, and he immediately took out the AR-15 rifle, which was fitted with a 30-shot magazine. Although police believe there were approximately 26 live rounds of ammunition in the magazine at that time, after having used some earlier on to murder the Martins. In the bag, other than the guns, was also a towel, a hunting knife, and a sash-cord rope in 2 lengths. Seated at table number 2 were 4 visitors to Port Arthur: Michael Sargent, his girlfriend Kate Scott, John Riviere, and Carol Villiers. Mr. Sargent stated that he had been seated at the table for about 10 minutes when he noticed that an Asian couple were seated at a single table near the western side of the building. They were eating a meal, and Mr. Sargent noticed Bryant near the table with a large sports bag and saw that he was staring at them. Mr. Sargent returned the stare briefly, and then he turned to the other members of his group and continued the conversation he was having with them. Mr. Sargent then heard 2 shots in quick succession. He looked up and saw Bryant holding a gun in a position indicating that he had just fired it at the Asian couple and was turning the gun on him. He started to move forwards and downwards, and the gun was fired in his direction, the bullet striking the top of his head as he fell to the floor. Shortly after, and whilst on the floor, he realised that Miss Scott, his companion, had also fallen to the floor. His first thought was that she was alive and that she had escaped serious injury, but then he realised that she was deceased after he observed the horrific head injury caused by the direct shot to the back of the head. She was sitting with her back to Bryant. Whilst on the floor, he could still hear shots being fired in the room. The first 2 shots fired killed Mr. Mo Yi Ng and Miss So Leng Chung, visitors to Port Arthur from Malaysia. The 3rd shot struck Mr. Sargent, and the 4th shot killed Miss Scott. The single shot which killed Mo Yi struck him in the neck, killing him instantly. Police investigators who attended the scene later observed that Mo Yi still had his dinner knife in his hand after death. Examination of his body disclosed that the muzzle of the firearm was close to him when fired because there was gunpowder stippling around the entrance wound. This observation is a process used by ballistic experts to try and determine the distance between the muzzle of the firearm and the object or body which the firearm has been fired at. The range used by Bryant to cause the injuries and murder people in the cafe was in most cases at very close quarters. The terms used by the ballistics experts who examined the injuries of the persons who sustained injury and the bodies of the deceased gave 3 ranges of shots: close or contact, being either contact or within a few centimetres of the body; intermediate, being within a few centimetres out to about 1 to 1.5 metres, and then distant, being 1 to 1.5 metres and beyond. Within the intermediate range and in the close or contact range, there is, with a firearm such as the one used by Bryant on this day, a residue of unburnt propellant which is discharged from the muzzle of the gun, which causes a stippling or tattooing effect around the entry wound. Miss Chung died when the bullet fired towards her struck her left ear and continued towards the base of the brain and the skull, causing lethal traumatic disruption to the base of the brain and skull. Assessment of the range of this shot was distant because of the lack of gunpowder stippling or searing. An examination of the scene indicates that Miss Scott, who was sitting with her back to Bryant, probably first slumped to the table and then fell to the floor after being shot in the back of the head. The injuries caused by the use of this firearm were, to say the least, horrific. There was no indication from an examination of the body of Miss Scott as to the range of that shot, but investigators believed he would have been quite close to her at the time of firing the gun. There were 5 spent shells located near the bag, all fired from the AR-15 semi-automatic rifle, which was later recovered from Seascape and admitted by Bryant in interview with the police as belonging to him. Bryant fired those shots in a northwesterly direction towards the couple at the table on the western wall, and then in a northerly direction towards Mr. Sargent and Miss Scott. He then turned and commenced firing the weapon at people further down the cafe on the western wall of the building. Mr. Sargent sustained an injury to his head which creased the top of his skull and which was described as a scalp laceration. The forward movement of Mr. Sargent, in all likelihood, avoided him sustaining a full blast of the weapon to his head, ultimately saving his life. When Bryant started shooting, the other male at that table, Mr. Riviere, who had been going back to the counter of the servery, jumped to the counter, and from behind the counter he observed Bryant firing his rifle. He later described to the police his observations and said that Bryant was not saying anything, but he appeared to be laughing in an aggressive way rather than in an amused way. He said that Bryant walked from table to table, shooting people in the head. He said he saw Kate Scott slumped over the table, and he saw Mr. Sargent, who was calling out, "Keep down, keep down." He then observed Bryant moving towards the southwestern corner, still shooting people in the head. Having fired the 4 shots in the area where he had placed the bag, Bryant turned in the southwesterly direction, down the westerly wall of the cafe towards table 8. At table 8, a visitor to Port Arthur, Mr. Anthony Nightingale, was seated by himself facing towards Bryant. From the evidence of one of the witnesses in the cafe who survived, Mr. Nightingale stood up when the shooting started and called out, "No, no, not here." He was then shot, a single shot to the neck area, causing fatal injuries with extensive damage to the larynx, thyroid larynx complex, and the cervical spine. The path of travel of that bullet was downwards, indicating that Mr. Nightingale was probably leaning forwards as he was shot. He was then seen to fall against the window by people outside the cafe, whose attention had been drawn to it when they heard the shooting. There were many people in the cafe that day who were members of groups touring the Port Arthur site. One such group, 10 persons in all, consisted of Mervyn and Maureen Shadendorf, Marie and Gary Broom, John and Gay Fiddler, Kevin and Marlene Sharp, Ray Sharp, and Mr. Walter Bennett. They had arrived at the Port Arthur site in separate vehicles, 6 of them moving to the cafe to eat shortly after their arrival. They were awaiting the arrival of the other 4, but seated themselves at table 9 and commenced eating their meal. They almost finished their meal when the others, Kevin and Marlene Sharp, Ray Sharp, and Wally Bennett, arrived and stood at the northern end of the table with their backs towards the position that Bryant was in when he placed his bag on the table. They were standing when Bryant started shooting. Having shot Mr. Nightingale, Bryant moved at close quarters to shoot Kevin Sharp, Wally Bennett, and Ray Sharp. The precise order in which these 3 men were shot is not clear. They were crowded towards the corner of the cafe with their backs towards Mr. Bryant. Mr. Shadendorf, who was seated at the table, believed that he saw Mr. Ray Sharp shot in the side of the head by a close or near contact shot, saying that he heard Mr. Sharp say, "That's not funny," as the significant noise of this weapon being discharged was heard at close range by these people. Then, Mr. Bennett was shot in the neck, once again by a near contact shot. Bryant would have been standing behind them, pointing and almost touching them with the barrel of the weapon. That shot, which struck Mr. Bennett in the neck, in the right side, left an exit wound on the left, and medical and ballistic evidence indicates that on exiting, that bullet then struck Mr. Ray Sharp, also killing him. Mr. Kevin Sharp was shot twice, once in the arm and once in the top of the head. The head wound was fatal. Mr. Ray Sharp died of massive head injuries, and Mr. Bennett died from injuries caused when he was shot in the neck. Mr. Gary Broom, who was also in the party and was seated at the table, was struck in the left side of his face, apparently by bullet fragments which had struck another person, probably Kevin Sharp. He was admitted to the Royal Hobart Hospital. Mr. Broom underwent surgery on the 29th of April for left side lacerations to his face caused by the passage of the bullet, and there was removal of metallic objects from his face and some bony fragments. Mrs. Gay Fiddler, another member of the party, received shrapnel wounds to her back after a bullet fragment, having struck one of the 4 people mentioned, passed on to hit her. Mr. John Fiddler, who was also seated at the table at the time, was struck in the forehead by shrapnel fragmentation, and he also sustained a small injury to his back with metallic fragments believed to be from another bullet which had fragmented on striking one of the deceased persons. He was treated for these injuries at the Royal Hobart Hospital and discharged. Bryant then turned towards table number 12, and seated at that table were visitors from Sydney, Mr. and Mrs. Kiston, and Mr. Andrew Mills. Mr. Mills and Mr. Kiston both stood up when the shooting started. Mr. Kiston pushed his wife towards the door. Mr. Mills was shot in the right rear of his head, behind the ear, at an intermediate range, gauged on the basis that there was no tattooing or powder burning from the muzzle glass. This shot caused significant head injury, which was immediately fatal. Mr. Kiston was also shot while standing up, and the estimated distance of the muzzle of the gun from him at the time of shooting was 2 to 3 meters. He was shot in the left rear of the head. He had moved slightly away from the table in moving his wife towards the door. Bryant then quickly moved towards the front central portion of the cafe in an easterly direction, moving in the space between the tables at the front of the cafe and those located in the centre. At table number 13, on the immediate left of Bryant, as he turned and started to move eastwards along the cafe, there were 8 members of a party of 10. The other 2 were seated at table number 16. The 8 persons were Faye Richards, Carol Pierce, Fred and Pat Barker, Ron and Carmel Edwards, and Robert and Elise Elliott. The other 2 members of the group, Lindsay Richards and Ken Pierce, were seated at table 16. At table number 14, there was a party of 3. Mr. Graham Collier, Mrs. Carol Loughton, and her 15-year-old daughter Sarah. They were just preparing to leave the table, having finished their meal. They were standing up to put their coats and jackets on. Shortly prior to that, 4 other visitors to the historic site had been seated at this table, but they had, a short time previously, finished their meal and left the cafe. 3 of these people were Mrs. McCack and her 2 daughters, Madeline and Alana. At table number 15, Mr. Peter Croswell was seated with Thelma Walker and Pamela Law. To the right of Bryant, as he moved eastwards, were 2 tables against the front window of the cafe. The first one, table number 18, was occupied by Mr. Mervyn and Mrs. Mary Howard. They were seated having their meal. At the other table was a party consisting of Mr. Jason Winter and his wife Joanne, their 1-year-old son, who had been brought there in a pusher, and Mrs. Winter's father, Mr. Ron Fowler, who had been visiting from New Zealand. When Bryant first started shooting, Mr. Winter wasn't at the table. He'd gone back to the servery area in a position somewhere behind the fireplace, which is almost in the centre of the cafe, and he was returning the plates and trays because the party had finished its meal. When Bryant shot Mr. Kiston and Mr. Mills, he was to their west, and his gun was therefore pointed in an easterly direction, placing the people at tables 13, 14, 15 and 16 in his firing line. Thelma Walker and Pamela Law at table 15 were struck with shrapnel or fragments from the shots which killed Mr. Kiston and Mr. Mills. Mrs. Walker sustained shrapnel wounds to the right temporal region, to the back and right ankle. Mr. Croswell pulled both women at that table to the floor, and as Mrs. Law was being dragged to the floor, she felt a graze to the rear of her head, and whilst on the floor, felt stinging sensations to her right side. It appeared at the time that she had been shot directly, but further examination revealed that the injuries were also shrapnel caused. Both women and Mr. Croswell sheltered under the table, while Bryant continued through the cafe shooting at people. People were now starting to realise that what was happening was a real-life drama, and was not a reenactment that some people first thought. Many of the visitors were seasoned travellers who had visited other historic sites, such as Sovereign Hill, where there had been reenactments of history involving gunfire. They had soon realised that the gunfire they were hearing was not a reenactment, and that their lives were in danger. They had little or no opportunity to react, let alone escape. They certainly did not have any opportunity or means to retaliate. Patricia Barker and her companions were at table number 13, and they reacted and took cover under the table on the floor. Mrs. Barker received shrapnel wounds to the right upper arm, left hand and left cheek. These injuries were sustained by fragments of shrapnel, most likely from the fatal shots towards Mr. Kiston and Mr. Mills. She sustained those 3 injuries before she was able to get to the floor. At this time, it is believed that Bryant shot Mr. Collier, who, along with Mrs. Loughton and her daughter, were getting ready to leave the table. Mr. Collier was shot from about 6 to 8 feet away. He sustained a gunshot injury to the neck near his jaw, and the bullet exited at the right back of Mr. Collier's neck. His serious injuries were treated in emergency surgery at the Royal Hobart Hospital. When he fell to the floor, he remained conscious, almost suffocating on his own blood. He could see Sarah Lachlan on the floor in front of him, and knew that she was dead. Mr. and Mrs. Howard were seated at their table near the front window of the cafe. Bryant shot Mr. Howard when he was still seated. Bryant had not moved from the position he was in when he shot Mr. Collier, and he merely swiveled to shoot Mr. Howard. The bullet struck Mr. Howard in the head, killing him instantly. He fell forward onto the table. The bullet continued on its way through the window of the cafe, and that bullet passed the table at which Mr. Beekman and Miss McKenna had been seated outside on the balcony. The noise of the shooting caused Mr. Beekman to immediately depart the balcony of the cafe and seek refuge. Miss McKenna had already moved off the balcony when she heard the first shots fired. Bryant then moved closer to that table, and he fired a further shot, striking Mrs. Howard in the neck. That was a non-fatal injury. He then, at some time shortly after that, changed position, leaned over the vacant pusher belonging to Mr. and Mrs. Winter, and placed the muzzle of the gun near Mrs. Howard's head and shot her a second time. This caused massive fatal head injuries. Mr. Richards was at table number 16, and he thought that Bryant, when he leant forwards with the gun, was going to shoot into the pusher, but in fact, at that time, Mrs. Winter had taken cover on the floor under the table together with her son and her father. Mrs. Winter was trying to placate her child, who was distressed and crying at what was happening, and obviously alarmed that any noise would attract Bryant's attention towards them. Clearly, Bryant, who was intent on shooting Mrs. Howard, did not observe the three persons taking cover under the table. Carol Loughton and her daughter Sarah, who had been with Mr. Collier, were separated by a short distance, but Sarah ran towards her mother and they both fell to the floor together, with Mrs. Loughton covering her daughter. Mrs. Loughton described the noise of the gun being discharged as very loud. She in fact had a ruptured eardrum caused by the explosion of that firearm. Whilst Mrs. Loughton and her daughter were on the floor, Bryant shot Mrs. Loughton in the back and shot Sarah in the head. It is most likely at this time that the close proximity of the shot to the back of Sarah's head caused the explosive noise which ruptured Mrs. Loughton's eardrum. Mrs. Loughton sustained a wound to her back which was 10 centimetres in diameter. She was later evacuated by helicopter and did not know until she had been operated on and come out of surgery the next day that her daughter had been murdered. Sarah Loughton appears from the medical evidence and ballistics examinations to have been lying on the ground with her right hand under her head when she was shot. Her right hand was injured as well, suggesting that she had fallen to the floor with her mother and was then shot. Bryant was now moving towards the gift shop area of the cafe, which can be seen to the eastern end. The whole eastern wall of the cafe was devoted to the sale of souvenirs, gifts and craftware. Part of the craft display came down to the southern end of the cafe towards the front window. There is an exit door out onto the balcony through the display area. At the time of this shooting, that door was locked and was unable to be opened either internally or externally without the appropriate key. As Bryant moved towards the gift shop area, he passed table 13, and Mr. Robert Elliott at that table stood up in the confusion of the moment. He didn't have any spare room to conceal himself under the table as the area was now fully occupied. Most of the people at the table had tried to take some sort of cover underneath. He stated that in the confusion of thought in the time, he felt that his movements may distract the gunman, and he felt that he had a reasonable chance of making it to the fireplace and safety. Mr. Elliott was shot twice as he moved, once in the left upper arm and once in the head. The head injury left some metallic fragments external to his skull, causing a head injury resulting in some loss of vision due to swelling of the brain. He underwent surgery and plastic surgery on the 28th of April, 30th of April, 2nd of May. He was then discharged from the Royal Hobart Hospital on the 4th of May. Bryant had fired 17 shots in his attempt to kill innocent victims in the Broad Arrow Cafe. 12 people were dead. 1 had suffered grievous bodily harm. 5 were wounded, and 4 had suffered significant injuries in Bryant's attempts to murder them, which all took place in 15 seconds. To give you an idea of how quick that is, this is 15 seconds. Bryant then continued eastward towards the souvenir shop area of the building. Working in this area of the shop on that day were Nicole Burgess and Elizabeth Howard. In the gift shop area was Sandra van der Peer, an army major who had travelled to Tasmania with her aunt, Jenny Moore, and they had been looking at the displays for about 10 minutes when the shooting had started. Miss van der Peer realised immediately what was happening and moved quickly to the display table right at the back of the souvenir shop. She sheltered behind that table along with Beverly and Peter Kelly. Mrs. Kelly, having seen Bryant on the balcony at lunchtime, and Mr. Kelly had moved to the gift shop area of the premises to wait for his wife while she returned a coffee cup. Ron Neander and his wife Gwen were also in the gift shop. Mr. Neander had noticed Bryant in the meal queue area earlier in the day. When he heard the shooting, he saw Mrs. Howard shot and then took cover behind a display table in the souvenir area. His wife was near the steps into the front part of the display area. In the gift shop were 4 friends who had been travelling together: Coralie Lever and her husband Dennis, and Vera Jerry and her husband Ron. They heard the shooting start, and Mr. Jerry thought it was a reenactment and said so. Mrs. Lever, Mrs. Jerry and Mrs. Moore, the auntie of Sarah Vanderpeer, hid behind a Hessian screen which they pulled around them to conceal themselves, which no doubt saved their lives. Another couple, Peter and Carolyn Nash, were also in this area of the premises. They moved to the door out of the gift shop area, but unfortunately that door was locked. Mr. Nash told his wife to get down and covered her. Near them was Pauline Masters. She had travelled to Tasmania with her sister and mother and had left them outside the cafe to enter the premises and look at things in the gift area. Bryant moved towards the souvenir area. He shot Nicole Burgess. She was standing near the counter. He was standing some distance from her when he shot her, and the bullet struck her in the head. She fell forwards and the injuries caused were immediately fatal. He then shot Elizabeth Howard through the right arm and chest. This was probably because she had turned to her right away from Bryant. She received a further gunshot wound through the chest, probably as she had fallen to the floor or was on the floor with Bryant moving further into the gift area to fire that second shot at her. Both wounds caused to Elizabeth Howard were fatal. At this point, Bryant turned the gun on Mr. Lever and shot him in the head. Mr. Lever had moved from the area where his wife was to take some cover and hid behind a pillar. His body fell just near the pillar. Bryant was most likely still on the far side of the service counter when he shot Mr. Lever. Bryant then fired towards Mrs. Neander, who was on the step near the wall behind the counter. He struck her in the left lower side of the face, and she was killed instantly. Bryant then appears to have been distracted by movement in the cafe area back towards the west and somewhere near the fireplace, because he turned and moved back in the direction from which he had come to a point near the table at which Mr. Collier and Mrs. Loughton had been seated. Some people describe Bryant moving backwards and forwards through the cafe. He fired into the cafe, injuring Mr. Croswell, who was still under the table with the 2 women. The shot struck him in the buttocks. Jason Winter, who had gone through to the servery area, heard a pause in the firing after he had shot Mrs. Neander and thought that Bryant had left the cafe going out that way. As he started to move to get out, his movement is likely what attracted Bryant to start shooting again. He was in an almost upright position, coming out from behind the area in which he was sheltering. He was heard to call out, "No, no," and Bryant fired twice at Mr. Winter. The first shot struck him as he was getting up, injuring his hand, neck and chest. The second shot struck Mr. Winter in the head. He died from the head and chest injuries sustained from these 2 gunshots, and his body fell partially under a table just to the western side of a brick fireplace. He was sheltering with Mr. Dennis Olsen and his wife Mary, and after that pause in the shooting, he was heard by the Olsens to say, "He's gone," and then he started to move before being shot. Shrapnel from those shots struck Mr. Olsen in the hand, head, and left side of the chest and left eye. He was treated at the Royal Hobart Hospital that night and was discharged the next day. Having fired those shots, Bryant then returned to the gift shop area. He found Mr. Jerry, Mr. and Mrs. Nash, and Pauline Masters, as well as an unidentified Asian gentleman, all crowded together towards the locked door near the gift shop. They had nowhere to go. He shot Mr. Jerry through the right side of the neck at close range. He then shot Pauline Masters to the right cheek in a downward direction at an intermediate range. He then shot Mr. Nash, not moving any closer than the position from which he had stood in when he shot Pauline Masters. Mr. Nash was covering his wife's body with his. He was also shot in the head near the left ear. All those injuries were immediately fatal. Bryant was in the gift shop for approximately 1.5 to 2 minutes. In that time, he killed 20 people, attempted to kill 4, wounded 6, and caused grievous bodily harm to 1. He fired 29 shots, very few of them missing a target, and most of them struck targets when fired at either point blank or close range.